Okay, welcome here to part 2 of our week 2 material looking at job costing. We're in the job costing chapter. This is exercise 16-11 and problem 16-1A. This is of the combined book. If you're doing this in the standalone managerial book, this would be chapter 2, 2-11 and 2-1A. Same problem, just difference of a book, and that's how it will be all semester long. Our chapters will be, just got to add 14 or subtract 14 depending on which type of book you're using. With this one, so far we have been talking about a factory type setting using factory type accounts like raw materials, factory labor, work in progress. Now what we're going to do in this problem is just to show that you don't have to be in a factory to use this. And you can even switch up some of your account names as long as they mean the same type of thing. So in this case, when we're looking at a law office, of course that's not in a factory, and we're probably not going to have raw materials. We're going to be using supplies like thick folders and papers and pencils and markers and whatever you need to do in an office. We're going to have supplies. Of course, our wages expense will be our wages to the actual employees. We will have, of course, operating overhead, which is just like manufacturing overhead, except we're not manufacturing anything. We're doing more service business. And then one of the other differences here is instead of calling it work in progress, they could call it that, but they choose here to use a different name. I would rather use work in progress. Seems like it just rolls off the tongue easier, but that's just me. And then as we get down to this last item, when you're working with a service, when you're all done with putting in all the different steps of the service, having the initial person put together the work, having somebody maybe check over it, and somebody else compile it all together in a nice, neat format, there's a couple different steps there, so you have work in progress. But when you're all done, you don't really have a finished product that you're ready to sell to somebody. It's all been there all along. And so what you do in a service business, instead of getting your stuff out of work in progress and into finished goods, you simply just take it out of work in progress and put it right into your cost of goods sold type of account, where in this case they call it something just a little different, cost of completed service contracts. So with this one, I just wanted to put in a couple of the initial accounts on how we're going to go about how you do this. So let's, all right, here we go. So for this first one here, we're buying some supplies. And typically, we would have debit our raw materials for things we're buying. So, but in this case, since it's an office, we're going to debit our supplies for the full amount, the full $1,900. And then we would have credited how we bought it. Did we buy it with cash? Did we buy it on account? And it tells us if we bought it on account. Now, going down to number 2, we've now purchased the supplies. Now it's time to start allocating some of those supplies out of our initial basic inventory account and putting it into the actual work getting done. Now, typically we would have called this work in progress or factory overhead as well. But this one, instead of using work in progress for remember we put our direct materials in our work in progress, but in this case, we're not going to call it work in progress, we're going to call it service, I'm going to abbreviate, contracts in process. Service contracts in process, and normally we put in our work in progress account like that, we put the direct materials. So it says 60% are direct. All right, so 60% of 1,600 that was actually used, if you do it on the calculator, it comes out to be 960. And then the indirect materials, remember we put those temporarily into the factory overhead. But in this case, we're going to call it operating overhead. And I'm going to simply put in the remaining, which would be 640. Math here. Now, if I've taken that stuff out of my supplies and put it into the actual product, I need to show that I've taken it out of my supplies. So I'm going to credit my supply account for the full $1,600 that I've just used. So I've used 16 out of the 19 original. Now, part 3 is where it gets to be a little tricky, in my opinion. They go ahead and say we've assigned labor cost. Nowhere in the first couple exercises did they say we actually incurred those labor costs. So if I was doing this, if I was making this type of a problem, out here to the side, maybe in 1B, I would have had, or maybe had 3A and 3B. In 3A, I would have shown actually occurred these costs. You've got to put those costs somewhere and bill them out or show that you owe the employees money, and then you can assign them. It's kind of hard to assign costs if you don't already have them somewhere. So if I was doing this one, if I had a make-believe 3A, typically we would have debited here factory labor, but this isn't a factory. What they're calling factory labor for this problem is services, service salaries, and wages. And I would have debited here the $77,500. And then came down and credited how I'm actually going to pay those employees, whether it be cash or maybe probably more feasible here, wages payable. And credit the $77,500 for wages payable. Now I've put that we have work ready to be distributed into my temporary inventory account. Now I'm going to go ahead over here and actually assign it as it tells me to as part of 3. But if you didn't have this one going kind of in the background, it's hard to know, especially where my credit would go, as you'll see in a second. So in 3 here, any direct labor costs, so 80%, and I'm going to pull up a calculator real quick. I got $77,500 and 80%, that's $62,000. $62,000 is going to go into my, what would normally be work in progress, but in this case it's service contracts in process. And I'm going to put that $62,000 here. The remaining, just like over here, the indirect goes into my factory overhead, or in this case, operating overhead. That's where the rest of the money is going to go. So of the $62,000, the remaining here would be $15,500. And then where the hard part came in when I was going through this is, well, what do I credit? Did they already do a wages payable and they just didn't have us do that? And the answer is yes. They went ahead and assumed that we already did this opening entry, even though we didn't. And so now we need to credit, instead of crediting wages payable, I've already credited that. I've already showed that we owe our workers. Now what I need to do is take our wages out of inventory, our raw wages, and put them into the actual product. And that's what I've done here. I've put them into the product. So I'm going to take it out of my initial service salary and wages for the full $77,500. So that's out of that account. 4 and 5 should be pretty self-explanatory. And then when we get down to finally number 6, what we're doing is taking all of our work in progress, or in this case calling it again service contracts in process, taking all of those amounts, and then finally we've completed some of it. And remember, as I said, we don't have a completed finished goods inventory account to put it into. Instead, we kind of just skip that step and put it right into cost of goods sold, or in this case, what they call cost of completed service contracts. And we would put the full $76,100 in that. And we would take it out of our work in progress account, or in this case, our service contract in process for the $76,100. Now, with this one, you're going to want to keep track of all of your work in progress accounts, because down here they ask you, what is your final work in progress balance going to be? So you're going to want to keep a little T account off to the side of these items as you go along. You'll definitely want to keep T accounts as we move on to 16-1. And I'm going to go through a few of these as well as we go through. Now, what I'm going to be doing here in just a little bit, I'm going to go through a little bit of the problem, and then I'm going to be switching over to an Excel sheet, and I'm going to expect you to have this printed off or able to view it on a different screen, because I won't be able to pull this up at the same time that I have my Excel document, because I'm going to be keeping track of a lot of different numbers with their different jobs, and it's a lot easier if we go ahead and do that in Excel. You could do this off on the side on a different sheet of paper if you want, if you don't want to use Excel. But that's how I'm going to, I think, easiest for you guys to watch as I go through. Just quickly, I'm going to go kind of explain a few of the items. So we've already have one job that's going, job number 50, and they give us some opening numbers for work that was completed last month. And it's going to be carried forward. Job 49 is done, and it gives us our finished goods total. Also, we have a starting balance in our raw materials. This just tells us that which jobs we are done with and which jobs we've sold, so we'll get to that towards the end. This is new stuff that's occurred, and then finally, how much work was done per job, and that's kind of one of the things we're going to start with. And with this first paragraph information when I look at the Excel sheet. So let's go ahead and start putting in some information once we have determined Part A. We're going to do Part A, and then as we get into Part B, we're going to do my Excel sheet. I think it'll help us. So with Part A, what we need to be able to do is figure out how much dollar amount, basically, or a percentage will go, depending on how much labor has been done, what we need to do for factory overhead. So it tells me in this example that I have $1 million in estimated factory overhead, $1,024,800, and then labor costs of $854,000, and they want us to know a percentage. So what percentage of labor costs should go into our factory overhead? So we pull up the calculator, and if you go back to my original notes, this is real simple. All you do is take your factory overhead estimate, so the $1,024,800, and divide that by your total direct labor wages. The hours we don't really need at this point. And if you divide that out, that's 120. That's at 1.2, or as a percent. Convert. No. I don't know where it is. Let's see if I can pull it back up. Okay. Now let's see if I can get it to. I guess I can't. Oh, we can't see the document, but we could fill in. That's not going to help us. That's frustrating. Okay, so we would have normally put in here in this box 120%. It was 1.2, so as a percentage, it's 120%. All right, let's go ahead and close this out for a bit. And I'm going to open up my Excel document. Now, I put in a couple of numbers here already. It told us towards the bottom there, paragraph 1, we had opening raw materials of $18,300. And it also told us that our job 49 was complete. So I put that down here in my finished goods. So these are all inventory accounts. If you missed my lecture, I used this as a lecture example, and we went through it. You may want to go back and watch that if this is a little confusing for you. So right now I'm putting in some of these opening numbers. What I'm going to look at now as well is go ahead and put in job 50 opening number, and it tells me in the first paragraph that job 50 had direct labor or direct materials of 24.4, and I had direct labor 14. You'll see why I'm putting an equal sign in just a second, because we're going to be adding numbers to this. Because remember, this was last month's stuff, and it's still not done, so we've got this month's material to add into it. And then it told me I had factory overhead of $19,520. Now I'm going to skip down because I've put in the finished goods for job 49. I put in the raw materials. let's skip down now to the very bottom, or not to the very bottom, but the very bottom of our initial information. And it says for job 50, I incurred another $12,200 in direct materials. And I incurred another $6,100 in direct labor. And then finally, I need to know how much extra factory overhead did I incur? Well, that's where Part A comes back into play that we just did. We said it was 120%. And it tells us, well, 120% of what? 120% of our direct labor costs is what should go into factory overhead. So our direct labor cost was $6,100 for this month, as it tells us there in job 50. So if we take 6,100, and I'm doing this off to the side on the calculator, I know you can't see it, 6,100 times 1.2, because it was 120%, that's how much extra needs to go into my factory overhead account, which is $73.20. Now I'm going to do that kind of similar thing when I get to job 51 in factory overhead. But let's go ahead and fill in the first two items. Job 51 was $47,580 and $36,600. Oops, sorry, $30,500 for the labor. And now the factory overhead was 1.2 times 30,500, our number of our hourly amount for direct labor. So that comes out to be 36,600. And finally, job 52 is 36,600 in direct materials, 24,400 in labor. And so what I need to do is take 24,400 times 1.2, 29,280. Now let's go ahead and total these up, each job, to see how much work in progress we have. And then I'm going to put over here a final total. Okay. So to start out, all right, let's go back. So we've got some of this information. Now, let's go back to part B of our Wiley Plus problem. I think that would probably be best. And then we'll continue on to part C. And I'm not going to, like I showed you before, I'll try to open this again. We'll try one more time to see if I can't get this to work, so I can fill in some information. But if not, all right, so I'm pulling back up 16-1A. I think I got it to work this time. Let me pull it up so you can see it. (16-1A), and we've already determined the first part was 120%. Now what they're doing here, and this is, you might think it's redundant, and it is. This is kind of what we just did, and so that's why you didn't have to do it in an Excel sheet. They ask you, go ahead and put in your beginning amounts for job 50. And so our beginning amount was, I'm not going to put in everything here, I'm just going to put in a couple of items, 24,400. And then remember, we added of direct materials, we added an additional 12,200 in direct materials. And so we got a total direct materials here, and I wanted to show you why I said it was redundant. We had 24,400 plus 12,200. I had 36,600 for my total direct materials. 36,600 for total direct materials, and then it asks you to go ahead and put in your direct materials over here. It's the same thing. That's where the redundant part is. We could have just added this way across, but no, they're having us go ahead and do it up and down. And then do our direct labor the same, our manufacturing overhead the same for job 50, and then having a final total cost for job 50. So you're going to do that for, so I'll pretend we did that. Now we're going to go to page 2, job 51. And this is where it gets to be a little even more so redundant in my opinion. Number 50, for job 51, it says, okay, how much did you have in January? Well, we had 47,580 in direct materials. We didn't have any beginning inventory. So if that was our only item, what's your total? Well, this is where I don't think you really need to put it in twice, or in that case, a third time. That's what they have you do in this problem. 47,580, that was our only number, so that is our total, and that therefore again is our total direct materials. Notice down here in job 52, the job isn't complete, so that's why they don't have you go ahead and total anything, just put in what has been worked so far. Now, part C, we're going to prepare the journal entries to record the purchase of the raw materials, factory labor, and manufacturing overhead. Okay, so I think this will be the last part that I go through, because this is probably the hardest, maybe C and D. I might look at D as well. So when I look at C, the first thing is we are purchasing our raw materials. Now I don't need to purchase the original stuff that I already had. So remember back in the original example, it said I had 18,300 in raw materials to start with. That's already there. That's already in my T account to start out with. Now I'm adding in an additional $109,800 of raw materials. $109,800. And then it told us that those raw materials were purchased on account. So that would have been my credit. $109,800. Now, part 2. We're recording the factory labor costs. Okay, this one's a little bit tougher in that the debit is just like what we have been doing so far. We're debiting our factory labor, putting everything in there. But notice how they broke it out. And when you look back at the original information in number 2, it says incurred factory labor costs of $85,400. Okay, so that's what I'm going to put here. But now to split it up, I'm going to actually split it up by what it says. I'm going to put the majority in our wages payable account, and then the rest of it's going to go to payroll taxes payable. So they've kind of just tweaked it a little bit here and tried to confuse you maybe. So I'm going to put, and I don't know exactly what Wiley Plus calls it, but something like factory labor payable. And that's going to be the difference then of the $85,400 $85,400, and I'm going to subtract out the payroll taxes. So what I'm actually paying my employees is $65,000. Because remember, just because we incurred the cost doesn't mean I paid it all to the employees. And then the employer had their own expenses on the side. So they call this in Wiley Plus something like payroll tax payable. I'm not paying the employees, I'm paying the government the remaining $19,520. Now finally, in step 3 of this section, we are allocating out all of our factory overhead. So that means we're taking what they've given us there, and let's go through that. So we have stuff that's going to factory overhead, into a factory overhead T account, and you'll want to keep T accounts on all of these, at least I would. I would keep a T account on my raw materials like how I had there in my Excel sheet previously. T account on factory labor head, a T account now on factory overhead. Now the first credit of my factory overhead, as we're reading through on number 3 now, indirect materials of $20,740. Now notice how I left the factory overhead blank for a second, the debit. I could go ahead and fill it in, but let's leave it blank for a second, and let's start filling in now all of the credits that make up our factory overhead account. And the first one is the indirect materials. So basically what's happening here is I'm taking things out of my raw materials, small little things like glue and staples, and transferring them over to my factory overhead account. So as I take it out of my raw materials, I actually want to take it out of my raw materials T account. So coming out of raw materials is $20,740, and it's temporarily going into my factory overhead. And then coming out of my factory labor, because out of that $85,400, that included direct and indirect costs. So coming out of my factory labor is the indirect portion. So the indirect portion was $24,400. And then if you remember back to Accounting 101 days, when you have depreciation, if it's on normal non-factory type things, you normally debit your depreciation expense and credit your accumulated depreciation. Well, here we're not going to debit depreciation expense. We're going to debit our factory overhead because that's part of factory overhead as well. And our credit would still be, though, to accumulated depreciation, just like how it normally is. So our credit here would be for $14,640. And then finally, it tells us we had some miscellaneous items, and we put those on account. So we're going to simply put in our account payable. We owe money of $19,520. And then our debit here would be whatever all of that adds up to be. So let's do that here. We got $27,440 plus $24,400 plus $14,640 plus the $19,520. So we had a total factory overhead to add to our T account of $79,300. Now the last thing that I'll go ahead and go through here is Part D. We're going to start assigning stuff out into work in progress, taking it out of our raw materials, taking it out of the rest of our factory labor, and then taking our factory overhead and allocating it as well to our work in progress. So our first thing here, it says we're going to assign our direct materials. So let's go ahead and assign our direct materials. And it says we're going to do basically all of it. Instead of splitting it out right now, we're going to show all of our direct materials that were assigned. So if I look down there to job 50, 51, and 52, what I need to do is add up all of those costs. So $12,200 plus $47,580 plus $36,600. What I'm doing here is debiting my work in progress for $96,380 that I'm using in materials and removing it then from my raw materials. And I'm going to do the same thing down here, my work in progress. I add up all the direct labor, put in the amount, and then take it out of my factory labor account. And then finally, I do my factory overhead. And what we need to do is whatever our wages, our direct labor wages were, so if we add all those up, it's approximately $60,000 and some. Well, we're going to need to take $60,000 times 1.2, because remember, it's whatever our labor wages were. Factory overhead is 120% of that. So I'm going to put 120% of whatever my labor cost was and take it out of my factory overhead account. Hopefully, as you're going through this, you have now been completing some of the T accounts. That's going to help you visualize what's going on. And again, I would have done that. I'll briefly pull that up again in my Excel sheet. So we had some raw materials that we purchased. Maybe that was $109,800. But then I got rid of some of my raw materials when I got down to part 2, when I was allocating, or part 3, when I was allocating some indirect materials. So I would have gotten rid of the $20,740 as part of my credit. And then I don't remember the exact number, but when you added everything up, it was about $93,000 that I got rid of out of direct materials and put into work in progress. And so that leaves me with about $10,000 or so final raw material balance when I'm all done. And then I'm doing the same thing for my factory labor. I started out, it says, with $85,400 in factory labor. And then I moved some of that to factory overhead. It told me that $24,400 was in factory overhead. And then if I do the find the balance of these two, if I take 85 minus the 24, I get 61,000 left. Pretty much guaranteed if I add up the direct labor in jobs 50, 51, and 52, bet you I'm going to get 61,000. And I'm going to then, so at that point, I'm going to move 61,000 out of my factory labor and put it into my ever-growing work in progress. So I'm going to have a work in progress from the direct materials, from the direct labor, and then my factory overhead will be in there as well. Plus, I had some beginning stuff. Remember, I had some of the beginning information. I had the beginning work in progress was the $24,400 in materials, and the labor, and then the overhead would all be in my beginning work in progress. So I would keep T accounts as I'm going, and also it helps. At least I had this going, but they have you do this as part of your assignment. In part B, they had you go ahead. Basically, you're doing this in part B. In team B, you're actually doing the journal entries, and they don't have you keep the T accounts, but I like to do that. I think it helps me to visualize what's going on, and hopefully to help make this make sense a little bit more. All right, I hope this helped you out a little bit. If it did, let me know. Email me or respond and comment on YouTube or hit the like button. It really helps me to know if these are helpful. And with that, I will see you next week for week 3.